Coming up, a recent HoopsHype article sets the table for why now more than ever, the Brooklyn Nets fan base should be all in on the Ben Simmons and Kyrie Irving in support of Kevin Durant Brooklyn Nets. We'll break that all down right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. DraftKings, FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and let you know today's episode is going to be brought to you by Rock Auto. Rock Auto's amazing selection and reliably low prices. All the parts your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. And by the way, tell them Locked On sent you. Dougster, let's get into the action. Let's get some traction. Trade value, as we set the table here. HoopsHype article, I think really does give a lot of context to where the Brooklyn Nets franchise is and why some of these decisions that we've talked about over the course of the offseason are a little bit easier maybe to make based on the landscape.
Yeah, HoopsHype came out with a really pretty comprehensive look at the top 100 players where they had their staff. They basically polled their staff. They got a great staff over at HoopsHype. They and looked at the top 100 players in terms of trade value, tried to look at their contracts. I know you're going to go through a couple of the specs here, like how they kind of broke it down. Essentially, though, we see these kind of happen throughout the industry from time to time. It's like sort of a comprehensive landscape of where general opinion is around players and their talent and their contracts and their age. And there's like a lot of different factors when it goes into trade value. And just a reminder before we even start there is that trade value is different than probably like immediate value for a team too, like, because you have to factor in all those other things. So sometimes trade value won't necessarily look like, top 10 players. The top 10 players in the league might be different around top 10 players in trade value, but it just because of all those other mitigating factors. But I think it's pretty interesting around where some of these Nets guys fell, and you got to scroll down pretty far for some of them.
we're going to have a bit of a big conversation here. We'll talk about Kevin Durant and some of those guys near the top of the list, like Doug is mentioning. Not going to be one-to-one based on talent level, but just to set the table and a little bit of pull back the curtain. We're down on the list here before we get to Kyrie and Ben Simmons. But HoopsHype did set it around, to your point. It's about the player's talent, the age, availability, positional scarcity, current salary, and then also the next contract and what that could project to be. And this is why I think these types of lists actually are really valuable, because it takes into what are the most important factors. You don't just say, well, player X is obviously incredibly talented, he's worth it. Depending on how many teams can afford to sign him, how many teams can take on that type of salary cap. And then things like, I thought the other one that jumped out to me here is positional scarcity, right? Some players are a dime a dozen by a positional standpoint, maybe guard play, depending on how you look at it. Whereas, as everyone knows, 3-and-D wings, well, those are the golden nuggets around the NBA, and that can elevate some of the names on this list. So are there, before we get into where we find Kyrie Irving and Ben Simmons, are those maybe the two biggest factors when you look at the framework that they utilized here to say why it matters most when you're talking about trade value? I mean, I guess maybe age probably comes in there big too.
Yeah, age is huge too. And cost controlled for a long period of time, like stuff like that, cost controlled at a lower number, like all these things are gonna factor in. Tomorrow I think we'll end up going through some of where we would move things around, a little bit more around places where we agreed on this list, disagreed with this list. I would say conceptually, I'm agreed with a lot of the list. Like, not every player. There's definitely things that I would move around a little bit. But like on a high level, I didn't see anything like totally nuts here. And so, and which is going to be important when I will say the Nets guys maybe they're a little low. We'll talk about them here in a second. Let me just real quick brief you. I'll just go through the top 10 just so people have an idea of what this looks like. Then we'll talk about KD, Kyrie, and Simmons. Number 1 is Giannis. Number 2 is Luka. Number 3 is Jokic. 4 is Tatum. 5 is Joel Embiid. 6 is Trae Young. 7 is Devin Booker. 8 is Kevin Durant. 9 is John Morant, and then 10 is Steph Curry. So I'm not going to read obviously all 100 because we'd be here for the entire 30 or so minutes. But that's your
number
basic
11, number 12.
It'd be like a Francesa
No,
show.
wait.
It's a Francesa in July when he's reading the box scores, and you just wonder like what exactly the producers are thinking. Anyway, so so that's your top 10. So let's real quick. We'll start with KD, I guess, like because I think the longer conversation is around Kyrie and Simmons. But KD at 8, like, does that feel right to you where that list is based on his age, based on the contract? We can read real quick what they wrote about on Durant. But did you feel like that was a good place for Durant on this list?
Yeah, when we talk about just that write-up, Durant's age, and that's what I was going to point to. I think when you look over the guys that are ahead of him on this list, age is probably one of the big discerning factors when you see Tatum or you see a Doncic, right? You're listing guys that are a little bit more in their prime, just hitting their prime and have more longevity. Durant's age and the Nets' lack of clarity with their other two all-stars makes his situation potentially just a smidge more open to interpretation than the players above. But assuming Kyrie is committed long-term and Ben Simmons is good to go, Brooklyn is unlikely to trade Durant for even the biggest of hauls. And that probably is what factors into where he falls there. Again, availability, right? What are the chances that the Brooklyn Nets go, you know what I'm thinking? Maybe we go ahead and move off of Kevin Durant. So that plays into it. I think everything else about it makes all the sense in the world. 197 million left on the books for him as well. There'd be a small window of teams that could afford to do it. I think age is probably the biggest one that puts him where it does as far as being in the top 10, but not closer to the top, because nobody else there, I don't think, when you talk about age, is really in the same range as Durant would be, and that's what keeps him out of being, say, top 5.
Yeah, I think if I was just going to disagree with I probably would move Durant up this list. I think they probably overreact.
I put him over Trae Young, probably.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like Trae Young, Booker too. Like that's where I think if you're dinging Durant for the other players' lack of clarity, like that doesn't really make sense. Like that part of that's one part of the process that I don't really feels like factors into where the value of the player should be. So I think if anything, like I'd probably move Durant up like 3 spots on this list to be like more in that Embiid range of players. Just because I think like that makes a little more sense to me. So I think that was probably one place I disagree a little bit about it. Again, not to rip your hair out, not like I have any. But
that's what happened. You looked at the list and then that was it. You couldn't.
If you look at yesterday's podcast compared to today, it's a lot less hair. Not like I have much to begin with, but the beard went. Yeah,
we went very clean. Very clean on the podcast.
All right, so we can quit burying the lead here. Like we'll talk. Let's go into where Kyrie Irving is here. So Kyrie Irving is on this list. Now this list, I will say, came out prior to the podcast yesterday, which discussed, where Brian Lewis said that there's and we talked about it, where it looks like Kyrie Irving, all signs are pointing to him re-signing. I think that was basically taken into account, but you have to go all the way down to 57 on this list to get to where Kyrie Irving is. And I'll read you real quick what the write-up on Irving is. Irving would easily be 30 spots higher on this list if not for his unavailability and the uncertainty on if he would even play for any other team other than Brooklyn. Very interesting there. As of now, it's hard to tell if he even has positive trade value. Where did you feel where they ranked Kyrie? And you can see up on the list if you're watching on YouTube, you can see some of the other players that were listed around him. I'll just do that real quick before I get your opinion. The 3 players before him were, CJ McCollum, RJ Barrett, and Robert Williams. And then right below him was Herb Jones, Miles Turner,
Cameron Johnson.
And Cam Johnson. Yeah. So what did you think when you saw that place for him and those other players that were around them based on what they wrote with the write-up?
Yeah, I was going to say, when they say 30 spots higher, if not for these non-basketball factors that we talked about so much, I think that's the only thing that contextualizes this in any way. When you look around the players that you have around him, a guy like Herb Jones, I mean, yeah, there's upside there, but good Lord, we're going to put this kid in the same category as a Kyrie Irving. RJ Barrett certainly took a big step forward. The one thing I will say, obviously we're talking about the factors that come into, you mentioned the note, would he play for any team that did trade for him? Maybe that's something a little bit more around the league that teams have this sense of, why would we even sniff around something like this, knowing that Kyrie Irving could very much say, I'll sit out an entire year. I'll walk away. I'm not going to be a part of another organization. Those factors all being equal, I think there is something to say within a list like this and around 57 about youth and the projection of where these players can go from here versus some established talents, even like Kyrie Irving, all things being equal. I think that we he's in his peak and his prime from a basketball playing standpoint. So you can cap what that talent is, and that becomes interesting when you're trying to balance younger players, and that's a lot of what you see grouped around him here in this 50-60 range.
Yeah, and I think this has nothing to do with the talent. Like, I think it's very clear. That's why there was very clear about the 30 spots. But the interesting part here is, which really dings him, and I'm sure, I got to be honest with you, I'm sure polling these guys, like the HoopsHype group, these had to be two of the hardest players to figure out. And like, because it's just, you just don't know. And the part where, of anyone on the list, if they got traded, who just would just straight up retire in like sort of his prime, Kyrie Irving's got to be like the top of that list. Like you would at least he probably consider it. Like that's been floated out there that he wouldn't play in anywhere else but Brooklyn. So how can you even give someone a positional trade value when there's a risk that he just wouldn't even take the court for your team, right? Like even if you were to trade for him. So yes, of course, like is he better by like light years better than RJ Barrett? Yes, of course. Like Herb Jones, Cam Johnson, come on, please. But and those teams would happily ship any of those players out on a 1-for-1 talent piece. I mean, you compile 5 of these guys together and probably ship them out talent-wise for Kyrie Irving. But the part is the uncertainty, and I think that the Nets fans, I think, continually undervalue that when it comes to like discussing Kyrie Irving. It's like, we're not talking about the skills. We're talking about the lack of certainty around this. This is how other people in the league view him, right? It's just like, I don't want to call it toxic because that's probably too negative, but it just, 6 question marks right in a row around like, this is where you can't even slot him. So I want to get a little more into this around Kyrie, because I think there's plenty of meat on this bone. And then also Ben Simmons, because got to scroll down farther for Ben Simmons. But first, going to talk to you about Rock Auto. This episode's brought to you by Rock Auto. All those makes and models of cars out there, buying car parts or truck parts can feel very, very intimidating. It doesn't necessarily even get easier when you go to those local chain auto parts store either. They got the big cavern in the back. Someone disappears. The unmarked box comes back. You walk to your car wondering if you even got what you needed. Not with Rock Auto. You can save time. You can save money when using Rock Auto. You can also make sure you can save 30 or even 50% over those local chain stores. Don't even bother going to the dealerships. Can't even hear that word when you're thinking about car parts. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers like yourself for over 20 years. The prices are reliably low for every customer. You go to rockauto.com right now. You see all the parts available for your car or truck. You write Locked On, just like our podcast network, in the How Did You Hear About Us box, and they'll know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
So the one other thing that I wanted to mention here when we're talking about Kyrie Irving is looking up then, it says on the list there, could be 30 spots higher. So you tap into what does 30 spots higher kind of look like? And
Interesting. Yeah.
That I found, exactly, Doug. I found that interesting. Because then you're talking about somewhere in the range of top 30 players that get listed here. Rudy Gobert at 26, Anthony Davis at 27. Injury is going to play a factor. Availability is one of the biggest ones you're going to note with him. Darius Garland there in Cleveland. Scotty Barnes for Toronto, who obviously came on in a big way this past season. And then Zach LaVine at 30. So, if you start to throw out those names in context around it, I still think you'd probably have Kyrie Irving, at, around, or above. Now, positional scarcity plays a factor there too. But I think that group of players, youth, talent, expectations, the money, all of those factors probably does feel a lot more reasonable for his peers as far as where he ranks.
That group feels a lot more correct. That group is where you would just kind of logically.
James, 25, by the way, age a big factor for him.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So like, I think like that group of players right there, talent wise, if all things being equal, is where you would probably slot him. Then you kind of, move it around with the money and all this and the years and all this other stuff. But that group, does feel that's more of a collection of his on-court peers, where he's he's clearly better than some of them in some areas, clearly worse than others in other areas. But like, it would feel like, so just as a comparison, if we were to just move him up 30 slots higher, like that, just above that group are guys like, you mentioned LeBron, but it's like Jimmy Butler. Okay, you probably rather have Butler at this point. It's guys like Kawhi, like a healthy Kawhi. Like clearly you'd want him. Zion, you have to dream on the upside. So like those, I would have a hard time moving him above any of those players, even if just everything was removed from the uncertainty. So that one feels more correct. And I'm glad they clarified it. Good job by you by moving it up that list, because it becomes more palatable. And actually, frankly, by the end of this season, with a normal season, maybe he just moves right back in with that group, right?
Yeah,
Like it would, like we're one normal season of just good basketball away from him just making that 30 spot leap, right? In all people's eyes.
Do you think 100%? I agree with you on that. It's again, right. The recency bias is what also factors in more so with Kyrie Irving or any player that has injuries around him in recent memory. But the positional scarcity that they mentioned as far as criteria, obviously guard play. Now it's not about the level of guard play, but that factors in, I think, specifically with Kyrie, and we talk about him as being an off-ball guard. He's not going to be your primary ball handler, or at least doesn't want to be at this point of his career. How much does that factor into where you think, I mean, guards in general, there's not about specifics on the list there, right? But then, because then I look at it and say, well, tell me a guy that, has a great effective field goal percentage and is going to be the complementary piece to your traditional point guard on ball. And that combined with money and everything else, even when we think Kyrie is deserving of being higher up the list, those other factors and controllability, those probably also, when you look around the league, people would go, well, you got to tell me that this is Kyrie Irving moves the needle, wins you a championship if you're going to go get him, as opposed to I got 5 other players that can give me 20, 25 plus points in a game and do it at a pretty effective clip.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's funny about where Kyrie, like sort of where we landed on Kyrie in terms of what he wants to do, because that shift really for him only happened after Harden came to the team, right? Like the willingness to sort of like redefine where he was positionally into more of a shooting guard role than a point guard role. Like he is still listed as a point guard, rightfully so, like shooting guard in some places. But that, again, you only have to go back one season or one season ish. A season and a half for them to, for when that conversation happened around who was going to be the point guard and who was going to be the off ball guard. Like that really hadn't been the case for him for his entire career. Like he had been sort of trying to bend the engine of the offenses at times. It's really just most recently it appears that he'd rather maybe come off some off ball actions in order to get into good switches and then get into his spots. And it's something to think about, it's something we definitely talked about as, sort of like the timeline has gone on here, because we could easily, like, depending on how this offseason goes, he might just go right back to that role, right? Like he might go right back to that primary ball handler in the offense. And I think that's another thing that makes this offseason so interesting is, like, again, not every team has to have just the defined roles. Not everyone has to be the same guy that dribbles the ball up every time. Like we've just been through this a gajillion times. Like teams just do this kind of stuff differently. But I guess my point was, you don't have to look too far back to just sort of reevaluate what you thought about him as like what his overall position was.
No, 100%. And I think maybe in some regards, we'll start to tap into the Ben Simmons conversation. That feels like hey, call it a tease in the business, because there is something around that and how this team looks to reconstruct itself a little bit this offseason. We've talked a lot about Goran Dragic bringing him back or not, or what else do they need to add to this? And we know what Ben Simmons' role, that's going to factor in here too. But if Kyrie Irving says, we all know he's capable of being the pure on-ball point guard, if he leans into that a little bit more, it changes how the Nets look at this offseason and what they need to accomplish. On the Ben Simmons piece, then, you mentioned scrolling down. Let's just set the table here. Scrolling on down the list, as one does when you think about a guy who's basically under 25 years old. He's been one of the best talents in the league. He's also been absent, and we usually say that makes the heart grow fonder. In this case, maybe not so much. 91 on the list of tradable players. You have Brunson there ahead of him, Finney Smith, D'Angelo Russell, who's been talked about this offseason potentially as a trade. Then at 91, it's Ben Simmons, followed by Bogdanovich, Barnes, and quickly for New York, that's Brogdon Bogdanovich, I believe. I mean, listen, just how far off does this feel? If there's a 30 position leap in, potentially if Kyrie just plays a full season for Brooklyn this year, how far up the list would Ben Simmons be, all things being equal, if he just played this past season?
Yeah, so he's another one. They say he could go 60 spots higher, right? Like, it's part of their write-up on him. It's like they could go 60 spots higher if all things, like if last season hadn't shaken out, right? And that's going to put him again, and that list of 30 spots higher starts to put him more in line with like other guys that you would start to think about too.
It puts him in Kyrie's spot.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's like
No,
it's like a little lower than Kyrie. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that Drew Holiday range, like, Halliburton, Bradley Beal. Like it's that group of players. And
Some DeJounte Murray, some Paul George, the Clippers. Like, I mean, talk about basically being that kind of 30s range, Bradley Bealish, like 30 to 40, somewhere in there.
Exactly. So like, second, like second and a half best player on like a championship team, something like that. Like that's what that level of, and like I said, it's hard to say number 2 for all these guys, but you don't want to go all the way down to number 3. So that one feels right. I got to tell you, there was a part of me that was wondering if he'd even be on the list. Like because you think Kyrie's got problems with his trade value. Simmons he's so close to not even be on the list. And I can make clear cases to taking him off completely, because the part where it's the absolute worst combination. He makes all the money. He has not played in a year. He has not played in a full year and was totally fine. I'm not going to go into all the reasons why it was, but he just was fine in a situation he did not like to sit out. Like he sat it out. He did not like the situation, mental health, whatever the reason was, he did it. And if you're a team that's trading for a guy and you see that he's got it in him for whatever the reason was, to just sit it out, make zero money, get fined in an effort to not play for your team, that's the case where I could mark him 30 spots higher. If it's equal, I could take him off the list completely, because how could you ever send enough money back? Even just the money. Like, how could you send enough money back to with anything comparable, short of like a Russell Westbrook or a John Wall contract, which no team would do, like coming the other way. And so this one was hard. This one,
boy, funny, you mentioned Russell Westbrook, because you talk about like having to match up the dollars, and in every scenario when you talk about Russell Westbrook in a trade, it's always, good Lord, who's going to eat the money in that?
He's not. By the way, he's not on the list. He's not in the top 100. Like, and rightfully so. It's like one of the most untradeable contracts in basketball.
But in that version of something, to your point, it's like, but in some ways you'd go, well, at least I know Russell Westbrook wants to be out there, right? Whatever he is, he's giving you everything he's got. Ben Simmons,
better or worse, when fans show up at the game, he will be on the court in a uniform. Like, and that's worth something. He doesn't necessarily seem like he makes your team a lot better at this point, but like, I don't know if you got to sell tickets. Like, there's a certain amount of people that will still buy tickets to see Russell Westbrook. Like, even that alone probably makes it better. So yeah, this one, like, we can get more into it, but this one was really interesting to me.
Another factor on the other side that I want to talk about for Ben Simmons, obviously, and why he falls on this rank of the list, and why those 60 positions higher that he could be ranked may be actually obtainable in the very near future for the Brooklyn Nets. But first, we got to talk about our friends over at betonline.net. That's because it's your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. You can find the latest sports developments, storylines, narratives, trade value charts. They're going to give you some odds about what could happen over there. Obviously, we know that the NBA finals are well underway, but I'm going to go ahead and tap into a little other known thing. That's called the NHL. Yeah, Stanley Cup odds. You can get over there right now and talk about the Lightning and the Rangers. How about it? Local 150 plus for the Rangers to take that series. You throw down a few shekels, you feel good about yourself. You get over on betonline.net, where they continue to be your source for all your wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device and learn more about the trends in action. Bet online, it's where the game starts. The other thing then on Ben Simmons, quickly, because we're saying about that scenario, and you mentioned like it's this perfect storm of bad perfect storm. Injuries, right? Then he also has the back. Like, and
I didn't even mention that. God, yeah, I didn't even mention the back surgery.
Enough, right? So, the big money, the curiosity around interest, or to your point, it's not even about his desire to play basketball. It's about my desire to play basketball where I want to play basketball, and my willingness to not play if I don't want to, and then the health. So, that there really is 3 negative prongs on here. And to your point, while I think could he certainly be higher up on this list if you have health, if he is committed, and the skill and talent level, of course, but I could say that he doesn't deserve to be on this list because there are legitimate full-blown question marks and then big money factors on the negative side for him.
Yeah, and these 2 rankings for these guys in a lot of ways just do highlight sort of like what's going on with the Nets here. Right. Like this, and it's become a theme for just, how you have to just talk about the team now going into the offseason. You have to talk about the team of like sort of what ifs and maybes and we'll sees and all this other stuff, because, and when you have 2 players by this, this staff's own admission, and again, I think we agree with it. It's more about again, it's less about like who the players are around them on these lists and more about what it just says, the disparity between what the clear talent level is compared to where they rank on the list. Like, and that's kind of all you need to know about where the Nets stand right now. And it's all you need to know kind of about why they're going to re-sign Kyrie and why they're just going to have Ben Simmons and why they kind of just have to make it work at this point, because there's no other option. If this is how these guys are viewed in the league, and I think they pretty much are, like, I know we just traded Simmons for James Harden for Simmons, but Simmons' trade value has not gone up. Not Harden's hasn't either. But but like, I think this just tells you all you need to know about like sort of how other people view these situations. And this isn't just some random people putting it together. This is, I think, kind of league consensus on being confused about what these guys are able to offer you on the basketball court at this point.
Yeah, and then let's kind of tie a bow on Kyrie and Ben Simmons in that regard. You look at this list. Do you reflect back on the James Harden trade? Now, it's funny because you say, where is James Harden's trade value right now? So there's a little bit of a like for like in terms of the value of the asset. Now, that unfolded a little bit more on the back end with the way that he played up and down there, inconsistent with Philadelphia. But do you think that the Nets did enough in that trade, right? We understand their hand was forced a little bit. James Harden wanted out. He wanted to go to Philly, etc.
Yeah.
But did the Nets need to push for more than some draft capital, Seth Curry, Andre Drummond? I understand it's not like they could just demand the world, but remember, whether it was some of the other younger talent on that team, should they have peeled back as many layers of that trade onion as possible? Because Ben Simmons, until he gets onto the court and proves it, is a somewhat dead asset on the books for Brooklyn outside of for them right now. Everywhere else, you're not going to get a very fair shake coming back.
Well, I try to look at these through the lens of how I think I felt at the time. And at the time, I thought it was good value, or it was at least, maybe not good. It was fair. And it felt fair at the time for a situation that just had, again, a million question marks all over. Remember, like, Harden had just put in that Sacramento. I can't even call it a performance. Like, he went on the court against Sacramento and did more to tank his trade value than like most players could ever do in a whole season's worth of just like stinking it up on the court. Like, it was so bad.
Yeah.
And so at the time, it's like, and remember at the time, you're thinking, hey, Ben Simmons is going to come over here. He's only not playing because he doesn't want to play for the Sixers. Like, he's good to go, right? Like, remember, these are the things that were thought of at the time. It's like, wasn't a back injury. It was, he just doesn't want to play for Philly. And so if you think about, and it's like, you give him 3 weeks and he's just going to ramp this thing back up and he's going to be a go. So if you think about it at the time, and you have to believe that was the kind of what was happening, then it's hard to ask to get more. I mean, thank God. It's a very good thing that Harden kind of had the exit he had from the playoffs, or else it would be so bad.
But that's
like the only thing kind of saving it from a narrative and just going back and with 2020 hindsight, because good thing that he didn't look any better like when he was actually playing, or else fans would really be crazy. I guess what you're asking though, maybe the better question is, if you just could undo it right now, would you undo it? Like, I think like,
that's interesting.
Like, what do you think? If you could just undo the trade, right? It's like, hey, everyone didn't work in a world where like you could do these things. It's like everyone just wants to go back to the way it was. That didn't work, whatever. I don't know. Like, would you undo the trade with Harden right now? Like, if you could?
Well, no, I wouldn't, because I think the upside there for Ben Simmons, I think we're all going to be pleasantly rewarded for being patient, or at least our podcast is going to be, because we said, hey, let's just let this thing play itself out, and once you see Ben out there on the court, it's going to work in a pretty significant way for the team.
I think I'd undo it.
Well, here's why though. Here's my biggest reason. Here's my biggest reason why. It's not even about Ben Simmons. It's about the player option for James Harden. You would have been sitting here saying, James Harden, I'm in. 47 million. How's it going? He, in a worst case scenario, he would have just opted in for that year, regardless of where he wants to go. Now, if he walks, that's great. But if he stays with Brooklyn in this world and he plays out the playoffs, however long it lasts, the way that it played out when he got to Philly, the value's low. The trade value is low. People are speculating whether or not he's shot. And even if he wants to get to Philly, at the very least, Morey is looking back from Philly and going, yeah, we want him, but not in the same way that we once did. And who knows where is Ben Simmons on that? Now, maybe the optimism would be the offseason opportunity to have Ben Simmons be injured and learn more about that, changes the dynamic there. But I think that's the interesting thing to me, is like getting off of the James Harden potential for a player option opt-in that could have really damaged you in a different way, at least for in the short term year. And it seems like clearly there was a rift between Kyrie and what was going on with James Harden, their perspectives on one another. Kevin Durant maybe had some frustration, right? Like something was going on there. I'd rather at least feel like I have a different band-aid I may have to rip off in Ben Simmons as opposed to waiting to rip off the James Harden one, because that seemed to be a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, I think I'm just not thinking about this clearly, man. I think I'm because like in my mind I was like, oh, let's snap call this back and just try to work it out or something like that, because at least like Harden is your third best player or something like that, you can probably win a championship. I don't know, whatever. I think I'm very clearly had my brain is so warped in these situations. I just can't even think clearly about what the reality around them is, because there's like there is no reality. Like there's no reality around these situations. This is the most abnormal set of circumstances for any team, and this is about a league who never operates rationally around this stuff. So it's like really saying something that this is the most irrational of all situations, and it's in a league that already has irrational behavior at its foundation.
And I tell you what, we're coming back for a conversation around Kevin Durant, some of the guys near the top of this list, some interesting names on this list as well. But we've also said that the shifting narrative around the way the league is going. I think maybe the league is waking up a little bit to some of this stuff and why it should play a bigger role in how you make these decisions.
All right, we're going to get out of here. We're going to be back in tomorrow. We'll break a little bit more down to this HoopsHype list. We'll compare Kevin Durant to some of the folks above and below him and see where he lands. Probably circle back a little bit on Kyrie and Ben Simmons as well. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to wherever you listen to the podcast. Free and available on all platforms. Hit the subscribe button over on YouTube. Gaining a lot of followers, man, on YouTube. It's really great to see all the comments, everything. Really appreciate it. It puts wind in the sails. So make sure you subscribe over on YouTube as well.
It's interesting, man. Trade value, shuffling the assets, seeing what's possible. It just brings to mind there's no escape. I can't wait. I need a hit. Baby, give me it. You're dangerous, and I'm loving it. Britney Spears.
Oh, R.I.P. No, she's still alive.
No.
Yeah.
She's all right.
Sorry.
She's
my
thriving
bad.
in a lot of ways.
And
she's
thriving. And one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.